In the previous video, I mentioned how elements that float to the left can be side by side, provided that their container can handle it. And what I mean by that is when you add up the width of each column, they can float side by side if their combined width is 100% or less. And that's why this is working, because we have this as 5 columns wide. We have this as 6 columns wide, and then that one as 1 column wide. And when you add all three together, that's 12 columns wide. And that's what we have set up for our CSS. Now, this is not going to work out if the total is not 12. So say, for example, if I make this first div with Ragus Photography, if I make that 6 columns wide, now this one is not going to fit because this takes up 6 columns and this one takes up 6 columns, which is 12 columns, and there's no room for this. So that's what I mean by that. Let me fix that. And another part that you'll notice is we have a flexible design going on right now. No matter how wide I make my browser window, these columns maintain their proportions. Now, I said we weren't going to do responsive or fluid design in this class, but I wanted you to see how you could go about making that possible, and that's through using percentages for your width. Now, later on, we will fix it so that it stays fixed with like this finished product, so that no matter how wide I make my browser window, it does not move around, it doesn't change. And if it gets small enough, I would have to scroll left and right to see everything. But we'll get to that later. For now, let's just keep it to where it's proportional like this, because it's kind of cool. Let's start with the easiest part then, in giving this some style. Let's add a background color to the header portion. If you recall from lab 2, we have 3 different ways that we can apply color. We could use a color name, or we could use the hex value, or we could use the RGB. I'm in Photoshop right now, so I can use my color picker to figure out what this color is, and it's giving me the RGB value, and it's also giving me the hex value. So I'll just copy that. I'll use that 958E7C. I'll add a header selector in my CSS, and we'll say background color with that hex value. Save that and refresh our preview, but nothing's happening. Like, what is up with that? Let me check on my inspect element. When I hover over header, it shows that it's trying to give it a background color of 958E7C. However, when you hover over header, it kind of tells you in the left corner there, it tells you that it's 2041 pixels by 0 pixels. The width is 2041 pixels, the height is 0 pixels. Now your width might be a little different depending on how wide you have your window. So when I made my browser window smaller, it's now 1386 pixels. So don't be concerned about the width. Let's talk about what's going on with the height though. Certainly the header is not 0 pixels tall because it has stuff in it. It's got this H1, this unordered list, and then this IMG element. So it should be this tall. However, here's the deal with using the float element. Whenever a container only has floated elements, the browser considers it as having 0 pixels for its height. So to break that down, the container would be header, and this header only contains floated elements. It has a div with the column 5 class, which makes it float to the left. It has a nav container that flows to the left, and it has a div that flows to the left. So this header container only has floated elements. And because of that, your browser considers it as having 0 pixels for its height. And when something is 0 pixels tall, you can't see the background color. Fortunately for us though, there's a fix. You can use the overflow property and set it to auto. Save that, refresh, and now when you hover over header, there is a width and a height to it now. And since we did not specify any kind of height property to our header, your block element, the header, the container, will resize based on the content. So if I were to add another li, for example, after blog, it will make my header taller automatically. I don't have to worry about indicating a specific height to this. So let me temporarily add another li. Now to accommodate that extra li that I just added, it made my header container taller. And same thing would be true if I take out stuff. It will automatically get smaller to accommodate everything in it. And this is the case for block elements by default if you don't specify a height. And this is usually how I like to do things, because when you specify a height, it doesn't make it very flexible, and you can run into some issues later on, especially if you are trying to create a flexible or fluid kind of web page. Next, let's make it look more like this text. And I'll start by looking to see how big my font is, how big the text is. And looking at it from Photoshop, for those of you that have it, I can see that it is 40 points for this text. And 1 point roughly translates to 1 pixels. So that means that this text is approximately 40 pixels big. And that's what we'll set for H1. We'll go back to our CSS and I'll say for H1, make the font size 40 px. Then we'll make the text color white instead of black. So we'll say color white. And here's the thing with this one. The whole thing is an H1 element, but half of it, the first word, is in italics, but the other one is not. So what we can do in this situation is use a span, or use a span element or span tags. We can say span class equals, and we'll say like italic dash text. We'll create that class later on. And there's my closing span. So within the same element, I have broken it up to where there's a span here where I am targeting just that particular phrase or word or text and I want it to be hooked to a particular class so that I can style it. In this case, make it italicized. That's the first step. I created this class and the span and all that. Now I will create this class italic dash text. And to make something italicized, it's font weight italic. Okay, so let's see what we have so far. I'll save this CSS file and then save my HTML and refresh my preview. And now it's got the correct text size and it has the correct color, but my italic thing is not working. So let me see what's going on there. Span class, italic text, okay. Oh, I put font weight. It should be font style. Save that. Refresh. Okay, there we go. That's better. Okay, so we'll go back to that because right now it's a little too close to the edge, but we'll deal with that later. Next, let's do this portion right here to where it's more like this, one line. By default, your different LI elements are block elements, so they're taking up the entire width of their container, and you can see that if you use your inspector. So when I hover over this LI, see it takes up the entire width to where contact me does not have room to be to its left. Same thing with gallery, services, and blog. So what we'll do is, for our UL, we'll create a selector for that, an element selector for ULs. Or not UL, LI, sorry. We'll say display inline. And when we make something inline, it will no longer be a block level element. Save that. And that's what we get there. Now it's one line. Looking at my mock-up here, it looks like I need to make it a different color, and then everything needs to be uppercase in capital letters. So I'll add some more to my LI selector. We'll say text dash transform. We'll say uppercase. And then I could say color white. Make it that. So we'll save that. And refresh our preview. And now it's all uppercase. It's white. Now I need to make it the correct size, which is 16. Okay, I don't need to do anything with that because the default is 16 pixels for text. Looking at my container here, I see that this text inside my nav is left aligned, and I want it to be centered because that's how it's set up within the 6 columns in my mockup. So what I could do is add a nav selector. We'll say text line center. And now it's centered within its container. And now I need to add a space between each LI. I will use my Photoshop as a guide for that. It's approximately, let's just say 35 pixels apart. between each one. So I'll go back to my LI and add a padding to the right, let's say, of 35 pixels. Refresh that, and that's exactly what we get here. Now, when I hover over my LIs, you'll see that to the right, because I added a padding right of 35 pixels, there is now 35 pixels of padding after each LI. Now, looking at blog though, it doesn't need that. It's kind of messing up centering all my text, that extra 35 pixels there. So I want to get rid of that. And one way to do that is to use a special kind of selector that will select the last child from a series of the same kind of elements. In this case, LIs. We're saying LI colon last dash child. Instead of having a padding to the right of 35 pixels, we will zero that out. So again, we're saying in a series of elements, in this case LIs, we want the last child, the very last one, to have this particular property. In this case, we have made each LI have a padding to the right of 35 pixels, but then the last one, the last child, we want that to have no padding to it. And that's what we did there. So let me save that and see if it worked. And yes, now when I hover over that using my inspector element, the first 4 LIs have a padding to the right, but blog does not. And then one more thing I want to fix would be that extra space you see to the left. It's in green. By default, unordered lists are given a WebKit padding start of 40 pixels. Well, I don't want that because it's messing up how my text is centered within nav. So what I need to do is create a UL selector in my CSS and set my WebKit padding start to 0 pixels. Now this says user agent style sheet. This tells me that by default, my browser is adding this to this particular element, and I don't want that. So I'll add a UL selector, and we'll just zero out that WebKit padding start. Instead of 40 pixels, I just want it to be 0. Okay, so now it is perfectly centered within the nav. Let's compare it to our mockup now at this point. The header portion is kind of starting to look like it, but we still need to make some more adjustments. We need to make it so that these line up a little better, because right now it's just kind of whoop, whoop, whoop. And then we need to move things away from the edge. And then also we need to get rid of this awkward space to the left, to the right, and to the top of the header. And we'll do all that in the next video. And we'll even work in adding this baby image before moving on to the rest of the page.